The horses didn't make a sound. They didn't need to. 200 of them stood in perfect silence under a silver Texas moon, their riders cloaked in war paint and moonlight. And in the center of it all, Thaddeus "Bear" Mallister stepped out of his cabin with empty hands, knowing full well he might never walk back inside. It began just 24 hours earlier, under a sky the color of scorched bone. The summer sun cracked the air over Bear's land, a no-man's strip of brush and dust between Amarillo and nowhere. The kind of place where men came to disappear, and where trust was as rare as water. Bear was mending a busted fence post down by the creek, sweat stinging his eyes, when he saw movement on the ridge. At first, it looked like a coyote or maybe a shadow playing tricks, but then it staggered, sideways like someone drunk or dying, and Bear stood up straighter. It was a child, thin legs, bare feet, dust-streaked face, a little girl, no more than 8. Her dress was torn, fringed deerskin, the kind worn by Comanche families. Her long black hair was matted and wild, her arms like twigs, mouth cracked from thirst. She didn't speak English, but her eyes said everything. Hunger, fear, hope, maybe, if that was still something she had left in her. Now, most ranchers in these parts would have grabbed their rifle. Comanche on your land meant trouble, whether they were children or not. Folks out here didn't wait to ask why. They just shot, then justified it later. But Bear wasn't most men, hadn't been for a long time. He laid down his hammer, held his hands high, open. "You lost, little one?" The girl tried to answer, but no sound came, just a weak gesture toward her mouth, then the creek. Even if she'd spoken 100 words, she couldn't have said it clearer. She was starving. Bear's jaw tightened. He thought about the men in town, what they'd say if they saw him with a Comanche girl under his roof. Thought about old Pete Morrison's rant last week at the feed store, how the Comanche were gathering again, how Chief White Bull had been seen riding with a war party near Palo Duro. Smart thing, Bear muttered to himself, would be to walk away. But then the girl's legs gave out. She collapsed in the red dirt, too light to even stir the dust. Bear didn't think. He moved. She weighed almost nothing when he lifted her, arms dangling like dry sticks. She flinched, but didn't resist. Too weak. He carried her to his cabin, a one-room shack built with his own hands, mostly empty, always quiet. He laid her on his only chair and fetched a bowl of leftover stew, venison and beans still warm on the stove. He tore a chunk of bread from this morning's loaf and placed both before her. The smell stirred something in her. Her eyes flicked open. And for the first time, Bear saw it. Hope, faint but real. She ate slowly at first, then like a starving wolf. Bear watched, hands clasped, wondering what storm he'd just invited through his door. And that's when he saw it. A necklace. It hung from her neck, half hidden beneath the torn collar of her dress. Beaded, ceremonial, intricate in design. Bear had seen one like it before, described in detail, actually. Just last week, in fact, when Pete Morrison had spat tobacco on the floor of the post office and told a story about how Chief White Bull's only daughter wore beads like that, said losing her would bring down hell. Bear's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Lord above," he whispered, "what have I done?" 20 miles away, under a darkening sky, they rode. Not just scouts, not just a hunting party. It was the chief himself, White Bull, at the head of a fast-moving column. The girl's trail had been found by a young tracker at dusk, the signs fresh. Prints, broken brush, a fence post with fabric caught on the wire. They followed it straight toward the ranch of a man who had no idea his kindness had summoned war. The girl fell asleep within the hour. Bear gave her his blanket, then sat on the floor, wide-eyed, staring at the fire. "What would you do?" he whispered, more to the room than to God. "Turn her out and maybe save yourself? Or shelter her and take your chances with a war chief?" Because Bear had just made his choice, and the drums were already coming. The first warning wasn't hoofbeats. It was silence. That deep, unnatural hush before something terrible breaks loose, the kind the prairie gives you when it's holding its breath. Then came the thunder. Bear stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, just as the sky lit up pink with distant lightning. Dust curled in the wind, and far off, rising from the folds of land to the east, came the drums. Not music, war. Slow, measured, rhythmic as a heartbeat, the kind of sound you feel before you hear. Inside, the girl stirred. She sat up fast, eyes wide, scanning the room until they found Bear. She said something in Comanche he couldn't understand, but the panic in her voice didn't need translation. She ran to the window, pointed. Bear followed her gaze, out past the creek, over the ridge where the scrub oak gave way to open plain. They were coming. First, just shadows on the rise. Then, one by one, they appeared like phantoms, mounted warriors, painted faces, feathers streaming in the wind. Moonlight struck their weapons, lances, rifles, bows strung tight, and they kept coming. 10, 20, 50. The girl reached up and tugged Bear's sleeve. She held up her small hands, opened and closed her fingers. 10, 20, 50, 100, 200. Bear's mouth went dry. Lord in heaven, the Comanche weren't riding like raiders. This wasn't a party out for vengeance. This was a reckoning. He backed away from the window and stumbled to the table, gripping it to steady his hands. The girl followed, speaking urgently, trying to mime something, pointing at herself, then slicing across her throat, then pointing at Bear. He didn't understand at first. Then it hit him. She wasn't just the chief's daughter, she was his only daughter, and that meant one thing. If they thought she'd been harmed, even slightly, nothing would stop what was coming. Bear turned toward the door, chest tight. From outside, a voice rang out. Not loud, not desperate, just calm, cold, and final. White man, you hold what belongs to us. Send the girl, and perhaps you will see the sun again. It was English, but laced with an accent as old as the land itself, the voice of Chief White Bull. Bear had never met the man, but he'd heard the stories. White Bull was no petty raider. He was the unifier, the war chief who had outfoxed U.S. cavalry units in 3 territories. The man who once led a party through a blizzard to rescue his people from starvation. A man who had never forgiven trespass. And now he was here. What would you do? Walk out and beg for mercy, or hide and pray the storm passes? Bear didn't wait for an answer. He pulled on his coat and grabbed the small pouch that held his most valuable possession, a worn photograph of his wife and son, both long gone. He looked at the girl. She looked back. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but something like it. Bear walked to the door, paused, then turned to the girl and nodded, slowly. She followed. When they stepped outside, the sight was impossible to believe. 200 warriors perfectly still, arrayed in a crescent around his cabin. Not a horse shifted, not a word was spoken. At the center, tall and grim, sat White Bull. He dismounted with the grace of a younger man, walking forward in long, deliberate strides. The others didn't move. Only their eyes followed him. He stopped 10 paces from Bear, studied him. Then his gaze dropped to the girl who ran forward and threw herself into his arms. She clung to him, spoke rapidly, gestured. But White Bull didn't soften, not even an inch. He turned back to Bear. My daughter says you fed her, sheltered her. Is this true? It is, Bear said. She was starving. White Bull stepped closer. She says you saw her necklace, that you knew who she was. Bear nodded. I was going to take her back, once she could walk. She was too weak. The chief's eyes narrowed. Or did you think to trade her back to us? A white rancher with our blood in his hands. You could ask for cattle or protection. Bear's fists clenched. I don't want anything from you. I just couldn't let a child die. A whisper of motion rippled through the warriors, bows raised, arrows knocked. White Bull's hand stayed them, but only barely. You will prove your words, he said. Bear's mind raced. How do you prove mercy to men who've only ever seen malice? Then he remembered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the scrap of fabric, the piece that had torn on his fence when the girl collapsed. He held it up. This caught on my wire. I kept it in case someone came looking. Figured you'd want proof. White Bull stepped forward, took the cloth, examined it, and for the first time, his face changed. This is from her ceremonial dress, he said quietly, the one she wore when she disappeared. The girl tugged on his hand, then ran to the cabin. Bear and the chief followed her inside. She pointed to the bowl, the chair, the blanket folded neatly. She mimed eating, sleeping, then pointed to Bear and smiled. White Bull's eyes wandered. They found the photograph on the table, the one of Bear's wife and son, framed with pressed wildflowers. You have lost children too, the chief said. Bear nodded, voice hoarse. A fever took them. 3 years passed. White Bull stared long and hard. That explains your eyes. Then, softly, almost too soft to believe, you may live, Bear Mallister. But then, his tone hardened again. However, my warriors will not accept words alone. Bear froze. What do you mean? White Bull turned toward the door, where murmurs of unrest now echoed louder. They came for vengeance. If they ride home with nothing, they'll believe justice was denied. The girl, sensing the shift, pressed close to Bear again. The drums had gone quiet. But inside, a new fire had begun to burn. Outside, the circle of warriors shifted like a restless sea, bows still drawn, fingers still twitching on the strings. Inside the cabin, the fire popped once and died. No one moved. Chief White Bull stood between Bear and the door, tall and unmoving, his daughter beside him. Bear watched as the wind outside picked up, carrying with it voices from the darkness, angry, impatient, calling for blood. Then a new voice pierced the silence, low, harsh, furious. It spoke in Comanche, sharp guttural words that made the girl recoil. A man stepped through the doorway, taller than the rest, muscles corded from battle, scars slicing across his cheek like claw marks from some older war. Broken Arrow. Bear had never seen him before, but he knew who he was the moment he walked in. Every tribe had a man like this, unbending, blood-bound, dangerous even to his own. Broken Arrow pointed a spear at Bear's chest, shouting something that made the cabin tremble. The girl gasped. White Bull responded, calm but firm. They argued, father and warrior, words like thunder clapping in that small room. But Bear didn't need translation. This was a challenge. Broken Arrow wanted Bear's blood on the ground, wanted it now. The girl stood suddenly and shouted, hands raised, voice shaking with urgency. She turned to Bear, grabbed his hand, pulled him down to kneel beside her, then turned back to her people. She spoke, fast, fierce. White Bull translated in a hush. She's telling them how she wandered, how she nearly died, how you found her, fed her, gave her shelter, asked for nothing. Then his voice changed. She's telling them about the photo of your family, that she saw your grief, that she felt safe with you. Bear looked around the room. Warriors crowded the doorway now, listening. But Broken Arrow would not relent. His eyes burned. He spat on the floor and raised his spear again. The girl stepped forward, between him and Bear, and for a second, the whole world stopped. She spoke directly to Broken Arrow now, her words slower. He asked her something, voice trembling with frustration. She answered. White Bull, watching, finally said, he asked her, what if it had been my child, not yours? What would you want done? A pause. Then White Bull added, almost in disbelief, she asked him, would he want vengeance, or would he want mercy? For the first time, Broken Arrow blinked, his jaw clenched, but the fire in his eyes dimmed. What would you do? Hold fast to tradition, even if it meant killing a man who had done nothing but show kindness, or admit just this once that the world might be more complicated than blood for blood. Broken Arrow stepped back. His spear lowered, he nodded once, and walked out into the night. Outside, a ripple of murmurs. The circle held, but the weapons began to dip. The girl turned to Bear, took his hand. White Bull looked down at them both. She has done something I could not. She turned vengeance into silence, but silence is not peace. Bear stood slowly. Then what do we do now? White Bull's answer came like a sentence passed by the earth itself. We ride, tonight. You will come to our camp. Stand before our elders. They must hear her story, from her lips and from yours. Only then will this end. Bear stared at him. You want me to ride into the heart of your village, unarmed, after all this? White Bull nodded. You saved a child, but our people have long memories. They've buried too many of their own at the hands of men who looked like you. Then I'll come, Bear said quietly, because I won't let her speak for me alone. The ride through the night was unlike anything Bear had known. They took paths no settler had ever seen, through arroyos carved by flood and wind, under cliff walls painted with old markings that whispered secrets in the moonlight. The Comanche rode in silence, Bear in their midst, surrounded, watched, judged, but no arrow flew. The village sat low in a cradle of stone, its fires burning low as dawn began to stain the horizon. Word had already spread. Faces emerged from the dark, women, children, old men with eyes like flint, and then the council emerged. 7 elders, blanketed, wrinkled, their hair white and bound in silver thread. They took their seats around the central fire without a word. White Bull addressed them first, then Broken Arrow, then the girl. Bear understood nothing of the language, but the way she held herself, the way she spoke without fear, told him everything. And then they turned to him. White Bull translated the question. Would you risk your life again to save one of our children, knowing what it cost you tonight? Bear looked around, at the warriors still clutching bows, at the girl beside him. Yes, he said, every time. The answer required no translation. The elders whispered. Heads leaned close, hands gestured. Then the eldest stood, voice like gravel in the firelight. White Bull translated, The spirits sent us a test. Not of how we make war, but whether we remember how to spare mercy when it's earned. He turned to Bear. You will live. Bear let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. More than that, the elder said. You will be protected. Bear blinked. Protected? Your land is now under our watch. If any Comanche harms you, they answer to us. Bear's voice cracked. Why? White Bull smiled, just a little. Because you fed a child and asked for nothing. The sky turned gold as Bear Mallister rode home, not under guard but under escort. 10 warriors flanked him like sentinels. The girl, Chief White Bull's daughter, rode just ahead, glancing back often, her dark hair trailing in the wind, no longer tangled with fear. The prairie, painted in morning light, looked softer than it had in years. But Bear didn't feel soft. He felt reborn. Behind him, in a sacred council ring ringed by fire, warriors had sheathed their blades, elders had voted for peace, and the daughter of a Comanche war chief had stood up to tradition and called it by a new name, mercy. That night, just hours earlier, had held every ingredient for bloodshed. And instead, it had delivered something rarer than rain in July, understanding. By noon, Bear was back on his land. The porch was still scorched from the torch heat of 200 horses' breath. Arrows lay scattered like pine needles in the dirt, but the house still stood. So did he. He stood with the girl for a long moment at the edge of his porch. You sure you'll be all right getting back? She nodded. Then, in a voice that still held the cracked rhythm of a young child but the iron of someone older than her years, she said, Thank you for saving me. Now I save you. Her English wasn't perfect, but the message hit harder than any bullet Bear had ever taken. She turned and walked off alone across the dry plain, back toward her people, her camp, her future. Bear watched her until she disappeared behind the ridge, then turned to go inside, and saw something that stopped him cold. Laid gently on the porch, folded with care, was a piece of worn fabric, her necklace tucked inside the edge of one of his wool blankets, a gift. No message, no marker, just a token that said you are not forgotten. In the months that followed, stories spread like wind on wildfire. People talked. Some said Bear was crazy, should have shot the girl on sight. Others called him brave, foolish, lucky. But no one touched his ranch. And when a band of settlers tried to cross through his land, rifles slung and anger burning, they found their horses refused to go forward, found themselves shadowed by riders they couldn't quite see. Whispers reached their ears that Bear Mallister's land was watched over by eyes older than the law. They turned around, never came back. And something else happened too, quietly, and not at once. People began to come, not settlers, not soldiers. Comanche, a young man with a wounded leg, limping into Bear's yard without a word. A mother and son on the edge of starvation, an elder who'd gotten separated from a caravan and didn't want to die alone in the wild. Bear fed them all, bandaged them, gave them warmth and space, and left the door unlocked. He never asked for thanks. But sometimes he'd find things left behind. A handmade bow, a pouch of dried pemmican, a carving of a hawk, talons raised, left on the steps. Peace doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it comes one quiet act at a time. Years passed. Bear grew older, but never bitter, never angry, never rich. But he became something rarer than any of those. He became respected. And every year, on the anniversary of that night when the drums came and 200 warriors rode onto his land, she came. No longer a child, a woman now, a leader in her own right. She would arrive alone carrying a pot of stew. They'd eat in silence, then talk about life, about the land, about what it means to do the right thing even when it might get you killed. "You changed us," she said once. "No," Bear replied. "You just reminded me who I was." She smiled then, and for a moment Bear saw her as she was that first day, starving, scared, but still holding on. When Bear Mallister died at 73, his funeral wasn't like the others. There were no sermons, no preachers, but riders came, from the north, from the west, on painted horses, with feathers in their hair and tears in their eyes. They buried him on a hill above his ranch, facing the sunrise, and every spring the girl, now grown, would come. She would sit beside his grave, lay down a single white flower, and whisper words in a tongue the wind carried off like prayer. If you've ever wondered whether one small act of kindness can stop a war, remember Bear. Remember the man who gave a hungry child a bowl of stew and changed the course of 2 nations, because in the Wild West, guns drew lines in the sand. But sometimes it took a quiet man with a steady hand and a good heart to draw the line that mattered most, the line between mercy and blood.